think we start. Kann man mich hören überhaupt? So, this evening is in English because our guest wants to, and I think we have some people in the audience. Good evening and welcome to the semester's lecture series. I'll give a quick introduction for the series, and then Gonzalo will introduce our guests for tonight. The lecture series is titled Effect, which is not a new term, but one that is reconsidered from works such as Spinoza or Bergson, Spinoza's Ethics or Bergson's Philosophy of Biology. Since the late 1990s, effect has been reused in the social sciences and humanities to include the widest possible variety of interactions and encounters that are not necessarily limited to human experience and human sensibility. Ethical and ecological behavior that considers culture and nature, the micro and the macro, technology and biology, and architecture that is performative or productive, not just symbolic, to name just a few agendas, have moved into the focus. Parallel to these topics comes a shifted attention to softer qualities or values, such as experience next to knowledge, potential next to progress, evolvement next to growth, or synthesis next to analysis. This shift could be described with the phrase touch and be touched, or as in the title for this series, affect and be affected. What architecture's place is in this remains to be discovered. So with this topic, we have invited disparate voices from practice, theory, and research. We have a total of 5 lectures that come out of architecture, also related disciplines. They also come from different age groups and backgrounds to reflect on this agenda. As you see on the poster, we will have 5 lectures over the course of the semester. And we start with 2 this week that interestingly both chose to circle around the topic of climate, energy, and environment. These are Pareid today, Deborah Lopez and Hadin Shargao, with their lecture titled Climate Frictions, with the R in parentheses, so climate fictions make us very curious. And Stefan Holst of Transolar tomorrow with his lecture High Comfort, Low Impact. So both will circle around similar topics, but I'm sure in a very different way. And then the next upcoming lectures will be 2 in May, also Wednesday evenings, and 1 in June. And before I give Gonzalo, I would like to thank Christoph and especially Gonzalo for organizing and inspiring this lecture series jointly with me, and all the tutors and the Institute for making this very professional with the microphones and the recording. We want to make these lectures available also for people that cannot be here tonight. And yeah, for making this an interesting and professional evening. And then we'll have drinks by Koye Wan, I think, after. So thank you both for coming, and Gonzalo, you'll introduce our guests.
Thanks for the introduction to this topic. I think it's great to have the room almost full. There is also still some places if you want to come to the front. So I think I think it's great that we have Pareid, Deborah Lopez, and Harin Chabel, who founded and practice as an interdisciplinary design and research studio, which is located in London, El Bierzo, which is North Spain. If you have been there, you need to go. Amazing food. And Los Angeles. And I think what is very interesting in the approach of this young office is how they approach and understand architecture, and proposing projects and interventions that are narrative driven, and they operate across different scales, media, in the forms of architecture, infrastructure, film, props, prototypes, and all sorts of other forms to address ecological and environmental experiences. And I read it directly from your website. The studio approach to architecture fosters disruptions to existing norms as a means to generating alternative versions of future realities through immediate fictions. And I think to some extent this overlaps quite well also with what the design studio in Caroline Smithbach Group is attempting to do. More on Pareid and Deborah and Hadid. They are both also lecturers at the Pareid School of Architecture, where they lead the Research Cluster 1 at the BPRO program under the title Monumental Wasteland, with a focus on climate fiction, so related to the topic they will speak today. They have also been exhibited at the Spanish Pavilion for the Venice Biennale, at the Seoul Biennale, Certain Pompidou, and the Tallinn Architectural Biennale, among others, and receive also already awards despite the young of the office, like the Archia Innova Awards in 2020, Premio Coop Emergente in 2020 as well. And they also curate our editors. And they curated the Pareid Perspective Issue 3 under the theme also of climate frictions, and also they are both directors and founders of this magazine, which is called Monumental Wasteland. I think they will explain more in detail also what it's all about. If you want to get it physical, we have two, not for you to take away, just to have a look and leave it here. But it's a magazine addressing themes around ecosophy, aesthetics, autonomy, logistics, and technology. So I think it's a very fresh, innovative way of understanding what practice means today. And please allow me to welcome Pareid.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Caroline, Gonzalo, Christophe, and everybody for being here today. It's been really incredible, actually, to have been able to see the pre-diploma not too long ago and then see some diploma projects today, and it's really refreshing to see what's happening in the school. We've heard a lot of great things, and so far, so true. Yeah, I think we'll just jump into the presentation.
Okay, so we are going to start this theme of climate frictions or climate fictions with what it has been called the Great Horse Manure Crisis of 1894, which was described by Brian Groom in an article published in 2013 at the Financial Times. In this article, and here I'm quoting, what it was explained is that in the 19th century, cities depended on horses for transporting people and goods. London, then the largest city in the world, had 11,000 cabs, all horse-powered, and several thousands of buses, each of which required 12 horses a day. New York had a population of 100,000 horses that produced 2.5 million pounds of manure a day. As you can understand with this, the stage for the 20th century world covered in manure was already set. For instance,
every street in London in the next 50 years will be buried under 9 feet of manure. Whereas in New York, the amount of horse manure will reach the level of the Manhattan's third-story windows. What is interesting about all of these imaginaries is that they were built on a quote that never existed. And this was discovered in 2018 when Rose Wild, which was the archive editor of the Times in London, began investigating the evolution of this story to find out that the newspaper had in fact misquoted itself. To specify a little bit, it is true that the streets of London were filled with horses and that their excrement was part of the urban life, as it was in New York and in major of the cities at the time. But the transformation from an everyday norm into a crisis coined as such, projected as a future pandemic, is a relic of a fictitious moment in history, which since then has been recorded, propagated to the point where it has transcended from the imaginary into the real. Coincidentally, with his timing and which we have been suffering during the last years due to the crisis, we can understand the parallelism somehow, like crisis sometimes can be misappropriated or appropriated for whatever we might be thinking about the future or how positive can be the future. Related to that, what we are seeing here is 2 views of Bangkok skyline on a clear day. And here, the same 2 views in the more recent days where the haze and pollution made itself clear in his capacity to modify our perception of the city, as we can see almost literally disappearing from the field of view. This presents a synchronous and biased moment that is shared amongst all of the inhabitants. And although through media, through social conversations and different exchanges are trying to somehow sort out possibilities through facts, figures, data pollution applications, and so on and so forth, what we were wondering at this time when we were living in Bangkok is what is the role that architecture plays in reassembling the collective in a moment of spontaneity? So we began questioning if these bodies that are moving, breathing, inhabiting, navigating different territories across the city can be understood as some form of environmental records in themselves. Not only that, but also what ways do our consuming, secreting, and shedding bodies produce material that can be reappropriated into architectural applications? And along these lines, we started to look into human hair as a material, which culturally and historically has its various interpretations, value, significance, even in today's times, right? Materially is something that we grow, we sterilize, we cut, we disregard repeatedly. And although it's biodegradable, at this moment is treated as many other trash and dumped into a non-discriminate pile of mixed and wanted waste. However, if we look closer, here is a complex matrix that retains the elements that bodies secrete, such as heavy metals. And with this, we began developing Follicle, which was like the first project that we started as an office, and that is an ongoing project that is like taking different lives across the years. So the idea was to use discarded human hair as an architectural material that was both sustainable, but inherently possessing some degree of affection. So what we produced, it was an installation, a pavilion that was used as an experimental laboratory and what we could be calling as a parliament in order to map the city's toxicity through a toxic cartography. The idea was to provide a device in the center of this pavilion that contained a questionnaire, a pair of scissors, mirror, and everything necessary to anonymously provide hair samples. So the device in the center, what was asking was like questions such as where you are living, if you are living in an interior, in an exterior space, or like working in interior, exterior space, related to which part of the city in Bangkok. And like what each of the visitors was coming was like providing what we can see here, like a little lock of the hair. So once the samples were sent and, sorry. So once the samples were sent and collected, we were working with a toxicologist who started to analyze the data from which we produce an online publicly accessible toxic cartography. So by the end of the event, we had up to 200 samples, 50 of which were at the beginning analyzed. And the project was like working into like multiple fronts or moments and with different parties. No? To, like we were working with an NGO who provided the means as with the hair felting machine, a toxicologist who was like looking into the protocol, hair analysis and interpretation of the data, a hair donation and wig company, which was based in Bangkok and was providing us with leftover hairs. And of course, a curious and motivated public in Bangkok. These projects, it happened by chance. It happened in the moment of the Bangkok Design Week, which was the week in Bangkok in which the pollution was the highest. All of the schools closed around. And at that moment, we were proposing to analyze how heavy metals that are contained and that can be analyzed through the hair could be a way of breathing the city. So these are some of the photos of the pavilion, which was made from human hair, hanging from this structure in a part of Bangkok, and that in the exterior, it was trying to somehow be appealing to people. That's the reason why we were using all of these lights. We were trying to not show clearly what the material was, but that in the moment of confronting it, to also realize how we value hair as long as it is in our body. As soon as it leaves, it's really disgusting for everyone, right? These are some of the details, some of the moments of the pavilion, and how it was looking through the different lights. So as part of the Spanish pavilion for the Venice Biennale, we were asked to do the last part of the project, which was the interactive platform in which people could start to visualize the heavy metals that were analyzed within their bodies. We created this platform that could allow that allows to understand the differences between heavy metals depending on where you are living. Here, what we are seeing is the different districts in Bangkok. These lines that you are seeing, it shows if you are working and living in a different district. And we were showing all of the heavy metals that we were analyzing, from aluminum to cobalt to arsenic and so on and so forth. We discovered quite a lot of interesting things. And one of them, it was that if you live close to a highway, the levels of arsenic are way higher. That depending on your diet, for instance, if you are vegetarian, is also visible. That if you smoke, is also visible in the analysis of the hair. You do it.
Sure. Yeah, so building on that and maybe looking at the human through another lens or another form of ecology, we began exploring the reading of human emotions, which are as active as they are withdrawn, making the dialogue between the inner self and the exterior world something that is being perpetually stimulated and interacted with. So with that, we wanted to extend this type of behavior that is often possessed into animate things like humans and animals into objects and architecture as a way of exploring this boundary between relational and autonomous existence. This was materialized in the form of a sentient and responsive landscape/object that could read, interpret, communicate, and also remain partly withdrawn. So in order to read the human input, it was fitted with various biometric sensors, such as a heart rate monitor, galvanic skin response sensor, and a webcam for expression recognition. And the idea was that by combining these different readings, one could infer both the balance and the arousal levels of the subject inside the space, and that is to say, to some extent, the kind of emotion that the person is experiencing. So Deborah was happy, which is good. And these are some shots of some of the effects of how the landscape would change with different inputs. And yeah, the idea was that somehow everything would sort of feed back into it. So the landscape would influence the human and the human the landscape, and it would sort of just evolve in that sense. And one of the things that was also quite interesting was we got to work with a performance artist. Gave her no direction at all, other than go inside this space and just explore yourself. So of course, she's a performance artist. She has some inclination of how to perform. But it was also interesting to just see her observe and work within the space and play into it a little bit. This is obviously the angry state, right? It's pretty easy to understand a bit. And instead of being very didactic about how one ought to engage with the piece, we sort of been playing with this idea of affordance and interpretation. So how does an object kind of communicate to you on multiple levels? And oftentimes furniture, for example, a chair sort of suggests how you ought to sit in it. In this case, we sort of overlapped many different common human postures and allowed the landscape to be formed from that. So it wasn't imminently clear how one might engage with it, but it provided various possibilities. This is just the landscape, just to give it a sense of scale. And the idea is that this could kind of be continuous. So it's almost one cell extracted from a grid. And there was these level of secondary details like these bumps. So going from smooth to textured and tactile. So this is the performer. She wanted to do it nude. We politely declined, but she was good. And yeah, some of, I guess, what we were exploring here was this resistance to architecture and responsive systems at a time when everything is driven by a sort of human comfort driving everything, or a sort of predictability driving everything. You approach the door opens to you, and this kind of subservience that architecture kind of has. We wanted to explore maybe reversing the roles, and again, giving this ambiguity to objects and spaces to be something that you have to confront and negotiate with, as opposed to something that is just in the background. We cut it just before it got too intense. So now we're looking back at architecture as a moment of collections and the collective. So this project, Pylon S, it was developed examining water as a resource and its climatic counterparts, such as monsoons and droughts. So this is especially relevant in the context of rural Thailand. The red dot on the bottom there is Bangkok, and the red dot at the top of the page over there is the site in Uthai Thani. And it's a very, very remote kind of area surrounded primarily by jungle. And the site specifically was sandwiched between a garden and the school building, where there's the main school canteen. And the site itself is a middle school and a high school. Kind of the middle school nearby had to close down because whatever financial reasons. So all of a sudden they kind of found themselves with an influx of students, various ages, and requiring a space for them to be able to collect and gather, have lunch outside, but also sometimes an outdoor classroom or whatever it might be. So yeah, this is sort of the current lunch setup, just kind of this table thing, or a counter where they get the food, and then they would just go eat it indoors. Yeah, but we started conceiving of how this kind of idea of an open-ended space could remain flexible while mediating the specifics of its ecological context. And it became very, very clear that water was extremely important. And this typology of these kind of water towers were scattered all around the landscape, and that maybe became one of the starting points for how to interpret of this infrastructural water harvesting building. Another thing that was quite interesting about the site and its remoteness were the constraints and the limitations with respect to machinery and labor. So everything had to be mounted by hand and mountable with just a few people. So this also partly influenced how the geometry was conceived as both a structure and a makeshift scaffolding. It also influenced a little bit the idea of modularity, because even though the angles themselves are a bit difficult to cut in terms of the idea that they're not quite very intuitive, because you have to cut the piece and rotate and cut and rotate. Once that's figured out, you could sort of turn it into like an assembly line. So there was this interesting thing about working with the laborers in this way and getting the pieces mounted. Yeah, so here we're looking at the exposed structure made up of a series of these modules with basically two inverted umbrellas at the core. And this is the building with its roofing, which basically allows the building to work as two large inverted funnels. The exploded axo on the left kind of shows the relationship of all the layers. So the water goes in, gets down to through the funnels. It gets carried out through a gutter into a tank, and then from the tank it gets pumped back out through this exercise equipment. And then on the right you can sort of see that story follow through. So the water coming through the gutters, Yeah, through the drains, there's a kid moving the furniture around. And the idea was that this piece of infrastructure would sort of stitch itself in between the building and the garden and kind of be a continuity with the climate in this way. So it would support all the indigenous plants that would be planted around the building. Yeah, and this idea of a kind of non-hierarchical space is also reflected in the plan. There's not really a head or a tail in this sense. It's very much open plan. And this is just to illustrate a view of the porosity of the building, looking from the existing canteen on one end through to the garden on the other side. And while we were exploring the school, the notion of water capture was evident prior to getting there, but once we got there, we came across there's gym equipment, and we thought what a pity to kind of leave them there. And because things like power, electricity, and all of that on a budget doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, we decided to basically refurbish the existing gym equipment, connect it to a pump that would pump the water back out. So while the kids are sort of playing or working out, they're activating the garden space. And this is something that we started to call a gardenasium, which, this section sort of illustrates that relationship again. And this is basically the overall diagram of that ecosystem. We then designed too much design, the furniture, and again with this idea that somehow the modularity would allow for flexibility in the space, so kids can sort of pick up the tables and the chairs and the benches and rearrange them, and allows the space to adapt into various types of scenarios. Yeah. And looking at the project, and it felt a bit pylon-esque, so that's why we named it that way. It was also filled with electrical pylons scattered around in the landscape, and it was also a nod to this kind of idea of a industrial vernacular, which is quite interesting. And yep, this is just to illustrate a few more shots.
So something that we have been quite engaged during the last years due to our teaching at the Bartlett is the idea of decommissioning, or like how to pursue projects without engaging in more extractive economies. So last year we produced this swing, which happens to be like one of the largest or the largest in Spain. But apart from that, the interesting part for us about this project was that we received like a very odd request that we had to remove an existing zip line, and we had to do something with the material of the zip line. They were asking us for a new swing, but instead we decided to like literally do the entire swing with existing material that we were having from the zip line. And this is what we are having here. But this movie, what we are trying to explain is the entire process of how we remove the existing structure to build the swing. It was like the zip line. So something that was like reversed in the way of like only design, right? The fact that you have to design with whatever you got. And something quite quickly was the fact that we were thinking that the landscape, this structure was already quite embedded within it because it was like rewrite. But also like how you have to somehow bypass certain regulations and norms in order to be able to do it, right? Because since it's not painted as a structure, sometimes this type can give you problems with the certification, the regulation of the structure. In this case, because we were counting with a structure that was like way bigger than it needed to be, we were able to leave it as it was. We decided to not paint it or to not do anything about it, like just as it was coming. So in the exterior, you can see like all of these marks from the plates to someone's. And also the geometry, we were trying to somehow reply to the regulation that says how the swings have to be, but also like using the least amount of space in the floor of the surface in order to live within the landscape. Which is also quite interesting for the client, because usually like clients do not like things that they halfway done or unfinished. But in the end, it's like can work quite well in the sense of being integrated within the landscape and the community. I now feel like really attached to it. So this is how the swing looks in the landscape. These are like just some of the details that we required to cut from the existing beams that we were having there. And we didn't have the, is this the video?
No.
Oh, okay. So these are like all of the parts that we were having and how we like basically combine them within the structure. You think that I'm missing something? So with this idea of the commissioning materials, last year for La Casa Encendida, an art space in the center of Madrid, we produced what was like the first iteration of the commissioning project with a video game. The video game was called The Gamer's Hat, and the idea was to add the decommissioning agenda with the idea of gamification and also playing with this idea of the primitive hat, which like I will explain now about the primitive hat.
Right. So primitive hut, I think, as we all know, is this essay. Now I'm blanking on his name, but I'll find it. It's a good name to blank on. Logier, there you go. That's French guy. Anyways, so in this essay, he talks about the idea of a primitive hut and kind of speculates a little bit on the history of how architecture first came to be. And in the very first chapter, it's always hard to read, it is the same in architecture as in all other arts. Its principles are founded on simple nature, and nature's process clearly indicates its rules. Some fallen branches in the forest are the right material for his purpose. He chooses 4 of the strongest, raises them upright, and arranges them in a square. Such is the course of simple nature. That's one aspect. The next aspect of the project is this notion of decommissioning. So thinking of Logier, one thinks of France and Paris. And yeah, here we are in Paris. Well, sorry, this photo was, or this rendition is around the same time that the essay was published. And this is a little Google street shot of the current state of things, and another Google street shot of the same thing, and here again the same. So the idea is really just to illustrate to what extent Paris has boomed when it comes to urbanization, construction, and then inherently linking it to where we get the material from, extractivist logics and things like this. So here are some very visual graphs that kind of indicate the consumption of those materials. And at the same time, we sort of find ourselves looking at abandonment of these infrastructures and the relics of whatever's left over. And oftentimes, again, as it was with hair, they sort of just end up in these dumps, piles of waste, and so forth. And what we started to question here was, if these are not sort of, you know, in an analogous way, the equivalent of fallen branches today, right? If this isn't our nature and if we can't deal with it in the same type of way. And the third aspect of the project is gamification. So the notion of gamification coming from this idea of how do we get people, the consumers of this ecosystem of things, to participate in architectural production, design, and so on. So with that, we developed this project, which is kind of translated through 3 different mediums. The first is a publicly accessible video game, where these modules are made of reclaimed pieces of wood, and they're also color-coded in a way that allows you to retrace what the size of that piece of wood is, and the public would be able to engage with this video game and create their own variations of this primitive hut and then save it. So that happened at La Casa Encendida in Madrid, which was quite nice. And we were able to get some data of what that, of those different variations. And this, of course, is kind of referencing Saul Lewitt's variations of an incomplete open cube. And we kind of like that idea. So this was a sort of reinterpretation of that. So during the 2 or 3 days that the exhibition was live, you could sort of see all the differences that that people produced. And these are just a little short selection of the ones that we thought were most interesting. Yeah, and this is just kind of cycling through all the variations, which is quite nice because again, there's this idea of maybe experimentation without necessarily being prescriptive at the beginning. And this is just maybe the first step for us in thinking about what the next step might be or what the next iteration might be. What might the rules be, knowing that we've gone through this first very non-prescriptive instance of the project. And this just gives it a sense of scale by putting a human there. Yeah. And this is what the actual installation looked like. You want to say something? So as mentioned, it had 3 components. One component was the video game, which is on the laptop. The second component is the actual pavilion itself, which is made up of the reclaimed pieces of wood. And on the back side, it's a little bit hard to see, but are 3D prints of the modules themselves, so the public could also physically build the pavilion. And this again was thinking a little bit about how do you transcend mediums and limitations in architectural representation, because not everybody can sort of think like an architect outright. So kind of opening it up to the public and participation sort of implies not being maybe discriminatory about the ways in which that participation takes place. The other thing is that this was made non-invasively. So the structure is all held up with these clamps. It allows the wood to kind of return back to its original lump of wood, or to be reconfigured again and reassembled again. So that was also part of the exploration. So here are some shots, again with the color coding of the wood, the game, game, somebody building his own version, and some shots of the details. So yeah, this is just a fun little thing we did to kind of suggest a new primitive hut.
So something that we started to question with this idea of recycling materials, resources, and so on and so forth, and that we present to our students in our very first iteration of Monumental Wastelands, it was this question that for what are we going to be remembered, right? Like if the Egyptians are known for pyramids, Romans for the infrastructures, what is the equivalent of contemporary society? So we went back and we did like this little exercise on looking into the 1937 the World's Fair in Paris, in which we could see like the 2 largest European powers facing off of what could be like a battle of in the form of monuments, right? Or like the monument somehow materialized as a pavilion, which we were having the German pavilion on one hand and Soviet pavilion on the other side, right? So years later, in 1943, the 9 points of monumentality are published. And the authors were like clearly criticizing them because they thought that they even though monuments intended to outlive the period which originate these monuments and constitute a heritage for future generations, forming a link between the past and the future, they thought that these pavilions lack the expression of man's highest cultural needs. So with this and with this in mind and under contemporary lenses, what we were like questioning is if maybe we might not be already be doing some sort of monuments or anti-monuments that we are like completely unaware, but that have more to do with what we are like leaving behind. That is not precisely the architecture that we are producing, but actually like the quarries and the spaces that in which the architecture is or the materials are being extracted. So we did this exercise of taking the 9 points of monumentality written by Sert, Leger, and Gideon, and we did our 9 points of monumental wastelands by crossing over different moments, which somehow were like making these points quite, I would say, more aggressive, probably, no? So I'm just going to go through like a couple of them, and like, for instance, monuments are created as aims and actions. They outlive future generations. As such, they form the future. Monuments are the expression of the eternal demand of people, which express collective force.
or every culture exists as monument, and this monumentality is deliberately utilitarian and conceived as isolated in vast schemes. Monument exists like trees or plants crowded and upon any odd lot of in a space. Modern and suspended positions can be the source of new effects. Such unexplored fields belong to our times. Man-made landscapes revealed to us by our view could be monumental architecture more than strictly architecture and city planning. So with all of this in mind, we have started what we call 4 small short stories on monumentality. And I'm going to start with Maya Bay. So for those who do not know Maya Bay, here we can see what is probably the cover of the movie The Beach, in which Leonardo DiCaprio here on the screen is being portrayed, right? So what happened with Maya Bay is that after this movie was released is that it's currently what we could call a manufacture or a byproduct of the Hollywood industry. So what we started to realize is that actually the movie was generating series of spatial operations that would make the island way more paradisiac. I think I'm saying that right. So in the first case, what we are seeing is actually when a tourist is trying to replicate the exact same image, CGI effects had to be applied in order to make this island way more close, way more private, more difficult to access. The second one is the island also had to go through a process of reshaping, as we can see the machine that shaped the island, but also that different species had to be planted, species that were not from this area, like the coconut, because what is going to be an island without a coconut, right? But what happened is that since the film was released, more than 1.5 million foreign and domestic annual visits have been coming to the island, which has provoked the closing of the island. So in 2021, in 2020, or in 2019, the island closed at the beginning until 2021. Right now it's starting to be opened. But this is a moment in which we think that the fiction starts to define the real.
In another but different instance of Hollywood, we see the reverse effect. We see the real creeping back into fiction. So this is a still of Star Wars' film, The Last Jedi, with Luke Skywalker standing on top of his native island called Ahch-To. But in reality, the island exists and it's called Skellig Michael. And it's located off the coast of Southern Ireland. And in the film, the island is home to an indigenous avian species called porgs. But in reality, these porgs are modeled after the puffin, which is a migratory bird who visits the island annually. And the island is actually classified as a special protection area, which essentially means nothing can be done that can disrupt the existence of puffins. And it even maps to what extent that this legislation applies to the island. It's actually 2 islands. So this sort of makes getting a clean shot quite difficult. So here on the left side, you can see this film crew getting set up and so on. And on the right-hand side, you can see what may happen, right? It's not what actually happened, but it could happen, something like this. So it makes getting a clean shot quite difficult. And the best option then was to sort of accept the presence of the porgs and then CGI, accept the presence of the puffins and then CGI porgs over each instance of a puffin. And then what's really interesting about this is that there are many scenes in the film later that you see that a puffin would never exist there anyways, like inside the Millennium Falcon, but they decided to start integrating the porg. So the porg, this fictitious thing based on a real thing, started having its own life and then kind of invading the screenplay itself, and sort of was met with mixed reactions among Star Wars fans. I'm not a fan, so I don't have an opinion, really. But yes, so it's interesting for us to kind of see how these real situations start to reshape the fictitious or the narrative situations.
The third story is based in Las Médulas, which is a World Heritage landscape. It's an actual mine from Roman times, which is spectacular, as we can see here in the Instagram or Twitter page of Spain. The interesting thing about all of this is that this is a mine that actually is a mountain that collapsed because of the mining process. That has been perpetually like photograph and rephotograph. What is interesting about all of this is in this area, this is the only mine that has been protected, and it has been protected by UNESCO because of different reasons, such as the beauty of it and so on and so forth. But something that we found quite interesting is that in the moment in which this was protected, from Thailand, there were like a lot of, let's say, discrepancies with the selection of this landscape because it was a mine, which was quite interesting because if we look at all of these images in the back, what we can see is that there are other mines that are being completely rejected by the population of this place. However, because this one was made by the Roman times, it was like World Heritage, right? So this type of idea for us, it has been like quite important in the research cluster as well, because somehow we start to like somehow question the criteria by which spaces and landscape are protected, and if to a certain point we cannot start to take advantage of those rules as a way to start to probably protect with different means these spaces, not to use human rules towards human benefits, but human rules towards non-human relevance.
And maybe the fourth story in this kind of sequence of things is the one of Svalbard. So this is a more extreme condition with respect to climate. It's the most northern inhabited town in the world. From the outside, it's very interesting, of course, because of how remote it is. But once you're there, it actually becomes even more interesting because you start to realize to what extent this place is caught in a sort of paradox, which we'll start to elaborate on. So strategically, or geostrategically, it's always been a place of interest, and it's been inhabited by Soviets, Nazis at different moments in time. And one of the ways that Norway can claim sovereignty over this, I always put the emphasis in the wrong area, archipelago, is by keeping the island inhabited, but it's not very fit for human life. There isn't really much of anything growing. It's extremely cold all year round. Most of the year, there's not even more than a few hours of sunlight. And so on the one hand, the way to keep the island inhabited and sort of claimed is to infuse it with a bunch of activity. So on the left side, top left, there's the global seed vault, which is of course very well known as the kind of doomsday vault. On the right of that is the World Arctic Archive that's going to be created by Snøhetta. And then underneath that is the UNIS, the University and Research Center. And we'll get back to that in a second. On the right-hand side, you can see you guys have avalanches here too, right? So you're familiar with that. And basically, with climate change and warming temperatures, there's an increase of avalanches, and the town, much like here actually, is nestled in between two mountains or two large hills, if you want. And the increase in avalanches has actually resulted in a kind of forced relocation of the city. So there's an active demolition process happening to relocate the city. And on the left-hand side, you can see what that looks like. And on the right-hand side, you can see sort of where the city is being relocated to and what that new architecture looks like. And of course, there's this weird schism between basically fundamentally altering the entire identity of the city, the way people live, and also because of very strict environmental laws, there's only a few places where people can actually build. So there's this weird conundrum or this weird loop of the island wanting to be inhabited and at the same time not. So this is some of that legislation, and we're always interested in legislation because it kind of creates these weird paradoxical situations. So with that kind of lent itself to this project we did for the Sol Biennale, and it's called From Svalbard with Love, and it was materialized as a combination of physical models, maps, and a quadriptych that display various scenes that were printed on a fabric. This is just to give it a sense of scale of, And on this quadriptych, because the trip there was it was basically part of a research trip that we ran with our research cluster. And so we interviewed many people of different types of backgrounds, some within the private industry, some within the more public initiatives, and then some just everyday people. And we decided to sort of scatter all these stories onto this quadriptych. and layer it with different types of visual, but also interview snippets. And some of them are really great. So there ain't no trees in Svalbard, which is true. And that's also sort of very nicely phrased by one of the head researchers at the Polar Institute. No one likes to talk about it, but Longyearbying's open secret is that it has the largest carbon footprint per capita in Europe. So this is also very paradoxical compared to their strict legislation about how to preserve the nature and making sure nobody leaves any trash on the island and so on. Yeah, and then of course there's one Tesla in town which gets its electricity the same way they all do, which is from a coal-powered plant, and isn't that ironic, right? So these are the types of situations and paradoxes you need to do if you want to sustain living up there. And the installation itself was also paralleled with an augmented reality application. And the idea was to provide kind of alternate scenarios, as well as the ones that are sort of playing out right now, with how or what the future of that place might be. So on the left-hand side, we have the existing town as it currently is. In the center, we have the seed vault being even more active because the world is depending on it much more. And on the right-hand side, we have that same seed vault, but it's now been flooded and the initiative has been abandoned.
So with this in mind, we set up our agenda for the Bartlett for the Research Cluster 1, which basically was like following some sort of methodology in which we will understand the context quite deeply, and we will proceed with what we were calling decoding. So basically it was to extract all of the entry points that will be then recoded in order to generate a world and to somehow embed within the narrative. So we are going to be showing like some of the projects very quickly that we will be like explaining afterwards also with the movie. So the first one with the commission in Svalbard, it was the first project that was looking at resources and scars in the town and like why the town had to be relocated. So what we were looking at, it was into looking how to distinguish different parts of the building through machine learning in order to understand how those ones could be resources for the future movement of the village or the town. Also, what we looked is to like what it means identity in these cases when a village has to be completely relocated, if we are going to be doing the exact same village that we had in another place, or if there is different ways in which we can start to understand the essence of something, in this case through social media and through like what we will call like the money shot, or the moment in which like the island starts to define through some series of architectures. So what we used was to generate a series of voxels that will be the ones in which we will be decommissioning the existing buildings in order to like reframe them or reappropriate them for the future typology. This is like some of the examples of it, and that was speculating how the town might be restructured and forced to a smaller footprint, but with all of the typologies, not only from a static point of view, but also from a functional point of view. These are just some of the shots. Developing this further, the following year, we worked with students in what we call gaming consensus. That was the first time that we were introducing video games, similarly to what we were showing with the project at La Casa Encendida. In this case, it was in Kivalina, which is like a town that has to be relocated within the next 5 years because it's going to be completely synced. So students were like, again, decommissioning the existing buildings to reappropriate those materials and reassemble them in something different. But in this case, they were using as an interface a video game that will allow the users to start to give their voice to all of this design. It was again using the idea of the voxel that was reconfigurable and so on and so forth. And the idea was to somehow use a platform also for material trade, i.e., instead of understanding your own property as something individual, what happens if we start to understand materials property as something collective, and how is that being managed? Which basically allow for independent and collective design decisions. So it was from the urban planning level decision to like the existing house or the existing smaller scale architecture condition.
Arctic Everywhere was speculating on borders and how currently the Arctic is not being seen as more than a resource that we are going to be constantly exploiting, and that's the reason why everyone is trying to get a piece on it. But also how borders, or the notion of borders, is quite outdated. And we are seeing this, and probably you guys are experiencing it way more than you know, how the borders are being defined because of climate change and how they are changing because of how the glaciers are melting, how all of these boundaries or frontiers that were very clearly differentiated right now are starting to like completely change. And in this case, what this platform was advocating, it was for if there is a way of using technology as a way to communicate or to like gather together different communities with different interests or with different strengths, and like how each community has his inherent dependency on particular aspects of the environment. So in this case, they were using cryptocurrency technology to execute smart contracts that were generated through machine learning algorithms and that will update borders in real time. That basically was mediating access to resources by different parties. And basically it was like negotiating the difference between profit and extractive logics over more spiritual and more indigenous perspectives. Some of these concepts we will be seeing them more like afterwards with other parts of the projects. So the idea was to create two models of players in the game, one that was represented through non-human and another one that was presented through human with different objectives, of course. And the platform was like a platform for trade as well as for a method for training the machine. This is how the platform was looking in the inside of the environment. And with Acre, which was like probably one of the like most spicy projects that we have produced, they were starting with this kind of thing of climate change is bad, but not for everyone. Somehow playing a little bit that we are understanding climate change is really bad, but from a conservationist perspective as humans, and that somehow the system that we have been developing during the last year is going to not be possible anymore. So what they were doing is to analyze what has been called the ecological transition zone within the Arctic, which is like the area in which is defined the tundra and the forest, and how this area is becoming like less and less tundra and more forests. And in this case, they were using machine learning to detect where this ecological transition zone is moving. They were looking at the existing ecology and they were like projecting the new ecology that will be happening. And again, we're using like this kind of video game to somehow simulate the different new ecology that will happen, developing a prototype to envision what type of animals, non-humans, will start to like somehow conquer these spaces. And these are like some of the machines that they were envisioning and some of the views. And last, lives, which is like an intelligent value enhancing system for the landscape, which was speculating on this idea that I was mentioning before, Las Medulas, and how actually different landscapes are being somehow protected, but the ways in which those rules or those norms have been defined is something that we can actually take advantage of. So the idea was to like remake new landscapes within this new area that is going to open up in the Arctic, but to make them impressive or aesthetically really impressive, so that they will be also protected. Of course, this is a speculation. And then using different methods to reach that goal. I'm forgetting something. And also, like in all of these, there are different computational processes that the students are using, such as visualizing to what humans are more tuned to look at, or more like, to what we have tendencies to like to look at, and how do we take advantage of it. So with this, I'm going to play here the movie.
I think it plays.
So
I think it's there. Yeah, and so I think the hope in sort of showing those series of videos is to kind of present this dual nature of how maybe ideas of ecology and preservation and so on were traditionally viewed, and maybe how those ideas can maybe be updated. And sometimes they present more conflicting situations and not necessarily solutions, but the problematics. So for instance, when we only value one particular scenery, how little can we possibly care about the one that is just slightly outside of the frame, and things like that. And the research that was conducted, or that's been ongoing at the research cluster, has sort of got us thinking about how do we bring in other voices dealing with similar types of issues. And then that prompted the launch of Monumental Wastelands, which is a biannual, because there's 2 issues within the year, at magazine, right, that features different contributions from different authors, and it's also augmented. So the thing on the right is the application that you can download. And this is again that same prompt, and it's also a bilingual magazine, and that's part of the initiative as well, thinking about how do we communicate across different languages and barriers and things of that nature. Yeah, just another shot. And the first issue was on autonomy, and it featured the people whose names are mentioned there. And it was quite interesting, the different takes on autonomy, and sometimes dealing with a more ecological perspective and sometimes a more technological perspective, and sometimes in between the two. And then the second issue explored the idea of logistics. And this was also interesting because it happened around this really interesting moment in time when the Ever Given ship got blocked. There was a ship crisis, ship crisis because of, there was a ship crisis as well, but there was a chip crisis because of some issues between EU and China and exchange and so on. And then of course there was COVID. So yeah, so these are just some shots of the publication itself. And then each sort of graphic design reflects a little bit what that theme is, in this case, autonomy. And the augmented bits are contributions by the authors themselves, again, thinking about the limitations of current media and how we can sort of push beyond those boundaries. Yeah, maybe this will be the last little video we show. It's just a nice little 1-minute snippet of augmented patients by Beeman.
So probably some of the ideas that we have been mentioning, with this kind of question of the monument and the 9 points of monumentality are here, like kind of going back and like kind of questioning in the similar format that we were doing at the beginning without crossing of those lines. And just probably to finish, like, like monumental wetlands as a research cluster at Bartlett, and also like the magazine, and somehow related the curatorial work that we did for the Perspectives Journal at the Bartlett, which is also accessible in in that website. That is, it has like a lot of text that are also like replicating similar concepts that we haven't mentioned today here. Yeah.
So,
and we think that's all.
Thanks for the amazing lecture. I think you're willing to take questions.
Yeah, of course.
So who wants to break the ice? First question is always the most difficult one. Then afterwards, all of you want to answer. See, the first one is the most difficult. Okay, I break the ice. I think I'll comment on question. I'm mesmerized about the what can I say, the freshness of you bringing your product to architecture. I see at least a lot of student projects from what I know this semester that can take huge inspiration with what we have seen today about the discussions that we have tried to do, etc., etc. But your work had to be break down at so many levels, from so many perspectives, from the technological, the political, if you want to talk about medium-specific things or multimedia things. Each project you investigates something different, will reflect a different scale, through different motivations. But what I think is extremely relevant in all that, it depends on the sources topic that you bring. You maintain somehow always a coherent line that I think it's very difficult to define and to put it in words, but it's somehow makes sense. Everything that you have shown today, even each project, it's here and there, it could be isolated, autonomously presented, but there is also a coherent line. So that's been said, and probably you is the most stupid question that I can ask out of that. How is the role of the scale in relation to your idea of monument?
I will say, like in one shot, I will say either scale less or planetary. Like we are trying to, like we refer, of course, to the power of 10, like moving constantly, because that's the way in which we are approaching things. But for us is that it doesn't matter the scale of the project that we have. It doesn't matter if it is a landscape, if it is low, if it is a little structure in the landscape. We are like constantly like looking at it in the same way. And it, like to your observation, it's also somehow difficult sometimes for us to put all of this together, because we think it's related. And when we talk to people, they are always telling us like, this is clearly your piece. And we are like constantly asking ourselves, like, it's clearly, because there are very different like works that we have been doing. And because somehow what we are trying constantly is to approach the project as like trying to understand as much as possible the context always, but also like how our like research within the research cluster and so on and so forth is also like coming back into even our own practice. So there is like all of these ideas that we have constantly that we are like going through. And going back to your question of a scale, we don't think it as something that we like reject or not reject depending on the scale, but we are like constantly working through those concepts, even if they are like in a much larger scale, and try to apply it into a very small. And this can be applied to the furniture that we design, to the swing, or to the research that we are doing with the students.
Yeah, I think it's not an easy question. So thank you. No, I mean, I think to some extent the the issue of scale with respects to the monument actually for us also has to do with the notion of the monument itself. So a lot of the things, and maybe the thing that we ended on maybe best illustrates that this kind of feeling of how the world was constructed and built up on top of itself in order to become what it is today. And the notion of how a monument is sort of emblematic of that. And then trying to maybe do away with that notion, or this maybe outdated notion of the monument, and looking at it from all these different perspectives and layers. And it's really interesting when you watch that entire interview with Hernando, because he talks about, for example, things like the use of drawing territories. It's not something that they had ever done before. And we saw a project today that was actually talking about that, the land ownership project from the diploma. And they would never delineate territory, right? And they would never outline it, but they started to do so only as a means to be able to present sort of documentation and legislation and so on. And even though that doesn't necessarily directly tie to the idea of monument as it was before, it speaks a little bit to the idea of how perceptions kind of alter in these different things. And I think for us, the notion of monument wants to effectively be kind of dismantled. And so same with the idea of wasteland. And it's a bit counterintuitive, right? Like some people think that at first glance we're maybe celebrating like the wastes and the dumps and so on, but it's actually meant to kind of juxtapose these ideas of what do you consider a monument and why do we consider it a monument and why has it been imprinted on our heads to be one thing that has so much more value when you can sort of look at it and observe it from any scale actually, right? So it's really a matter of perception, I think. And for us, that's maybe how I think we like to be scaleless in a way, because otherwise it starts to create that weird sort of hierarchy again. And I think we're more interested in that sort of myriad of positions coexisting. So maybe that's a weird rounded way of trying to get to an answer, but yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for this really nice lecture. And I have a question what refers more to your amazing broad portfolio of projects. So all your work is very multi-directional. So it starts with actually with a building, goes to installation, and we have like this teaching, research, and game engine, very individual, and so on. So like in this terms, how would you say, like, how does that happen? It's a quite simple question, because I mean, like, usually you would start to focus on something, but you have like such a spectrum, and it's very interesting. But how does that happen?
Yeah, that's you can start. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. COVID happened. So, but like, no, I mean, to begin, like our approach to technology has always been like a little bit flirting. We like it, but we don't want like to somehow like be too much on like, we like to like all of the political, social implications of a project, and we like technology. So we have always like been flirting around, and even like the people that we worked before we had our own office or where we study, no? Because we study, like we didn't mention it, but I mean, I come from Spain, obviously, my accent clearly, and Hadim from LA. And we both met in Thailand working for a French architect, and then we moved to Tokyo. So in Tokyo, we were like doing digital fabrication, but at the time where everyone was using robot arms, and we didn't have robot arms. So we had like to completely redo like an entire design agenda on computational design, but using humans. So that already was like kind of, it was shifting our perception of what technology could be, like rather than through optimization and so on and so forth. It's like, how can you embrace inaccuracy with human construction on site? How can you use materials that are very difficult to control or like to somehow to compute, right? So all of this has always like make us that our relationship to technology is like one toe in, one toe out, and like we like it, we enjoy it, and we think that it has like a very important and powerful role. But also what happened is that The projects that we were showing at the beginning, especially the two first ones, were done in Bangkok, when we were teaching in Bangkok. And like, we are interested in producing, either if it is a small or a larger scale, we like producing, and even if it is video games. So we move well with like laws, with research and so on, but we like. But what happened when we came to the Barlet is that COVID started. So we like couldn't do any material research. It wouldn't make any sense. We had like all of our students were working from China. So we had to like use a medium in which we will feel like quite interested. And at that time we started to think about interactive platform as a medium for us to like start to explore further. And what happened is that several projects that we had in mind, in which they were extremely complex, were very easily to communicate to students through video game engine. Like suddenly the planetarity or like landscape design or terraforming was possible to like embrace it and to interact with it through video game engines. Whereas when we were doing it through material research, that probably would be like the way in which we will have default if we didn't have COVID. It was always like a much more pavilion scale project. That was like what we were taught at the time in Tokyo.
Yeah, and I think also maybe one of the things is that for us, we don't necessarily have a medium that we fall back on. So in a weird way, I remember once, who was it? I think it was Hernandez Alonso. He gave a lecture at the University of Tokyo, and he said something like his generation were the experts of a few things, and then the next generation, which was us, is sort of experts at nothing, but kind of knows a lot about a lot of different things in a weird way. So I think in a weird way that's actually true. We don't necessarily pigeonhole ourselves into one specific thing that we repeat and then become specifically specialized in. And I think that's also partially because a lot of our work is always kind of grounded on narrative and research. So we like to start there and then reach out and find the tools to execute an idea, as opposed to sort of having a tool set and then being predefined by those tools. And maybe that comes from the University of Tokyo too, where they were trying to do digital fabrication in a school that had no robots. So it was like, well, what do you do? You know, you have to find a different way. Oh, yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. First of all, very, very refreshing. I really liked the projects you showed in the beginning, the project next to the school in Thailand, and then also the swing. I think they were beautiful in their simplicity and in the not rigidity, but clarity. And I'm wondering, because with the wasteland projects, if I understood correctly, you talk about taking away layers, and this is what the indigenous person talked about. No, we have to sort of redo the layers that were put on top. And I'm just sit here wondering whether actually with the way of working, you add layers in this work that you, in the end, no, all the technology layer, and then the dismantling everything has to be put in voxels, so you can recomputerize it. Yeah. But with the swing or the other project, which is so beautifully decommissioning what we have, and you put it together according to what it is and not according to something else that comes. So I don't know, maybe this is a stupid question, but I actually don't really think there are layers taken down, there are layers. What's your take on this?
Thank you for the question. Definitely. I think that some of the questions that we were asking Alexander this afternoon, like we also fall sometimes into like the same type of situations even within our own works. But I think that with the last video that we were seeing, like probably like I'm reinterpreting with Hernando was talking about, right? He's talking about a series of knowledge that has been implemented, like from a colonial point of view, in order to somehow control wherever is as nature, resources, and so on and so forth. So to a certain extent, like I think that what he's trying to present is like a different way of understanding. And what we are trying with the video games and with all of these type of uses is to like give form to these new understandings to a certain extent, and new rules or laws of interaction within this same like kind of understanding. So for instance, when we were presenting Arctic Everywhere, that is somehow questioning the notion of borders. It's like very much related to this. We haven't drawn a map ever, and we had to draw it just in order to like say, hey, this is my territory, even though I would have never had to claim it because like I'm just taking care of it. I'm not the owner, right? So with this idea, like some of the projects that we have been showing that use video game engines, they are like trying to like give form to this kind of, let's say, more abstract way of understanding the landscape. And to like you present like one like very clear point in the formalization of the research cluster 1 with the idea of the voxel, which we somehow are like almost forced to use it because we haven't found a better way of doing it. In the case of the swing, which is like very similar agenda, existing materials, I'm going to do something else with them, right? What happens is that with the voxel, we have like a way of like turning it into a building that makes sense, which at the very end, like we are also like guilty of because we are part of a system in which at the very end the students have to make like a one-to-one model and the building has to work and so on and so forth. And so far, within the series of iterations, we haven't reached a better model to do it for like creating, let's say, inhabitation, which is what those students are being asked, and to a certain extent we are being asked as well. With the swing, we were like able to like be way more open and creative.
But it's much more direct and much more
Yeah.
simple now.
Yeah,
The other
definitely.
is, that's what I mean. It's
Yeah.
actually adding a layer that's
Completely.
well,
Yeah,
question. No?
I completely agree.
I agree. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
See, now everyone wants to. I would like also to hear some from students. Would you like? I want students. Would you like? It's almost finishing, so I don't know if it's.
What I find really interesting is that many of the projects about kind of urban mining, prices up, and especially with the swing project, you mentioned that you had problems with political regulations and so on. And I think we architects, we are more or less working in a state of mind, right? But politics and construction are more in a state of technique, state of art. So what do you think is, like years ago, I think the gap in between is like bigger than it is now. Do you think then in future, in the next decades, it's possible that this rethinking of resource management or mining and designing with already used material can gather along with the political regulations and come together so that it's easier for us architects, but also for construction firms and so on, to work with already produced stuff, and what are the adventures and the advantages of it?
Yeah. So what's the question? You want to take it? Okay.
You can start.
Yeah. Everyone was talking all of them. To your question, yes, I think that there is going to be like a new way of tracing material, similar to what we are presenting with the decommissioning projects. This idea of demolishing a building, we do not know where the material goes. I think that's going to disappear. And in Japan, we already saw it quite a bit. Japan has like the biggest, I think, construction industry going on. Like buildings do not last longer than 20 years. And actually what has value is the land. So what they are like implementing as a system is like, there is no waste. Wherever you are throwing, it has a name. Like even, for instance, for us, when we were there, if you wanted to throw away a bicycle, you have to name it, and you have to like, so you are responsible of your own waste into like many multiple levels. And this is also happening with toxic waste, for instance. So I think that the traceability of the materials will allow that it's easier to use it. The problems that we faced are, or the problems that we faced with the swing were, first of all, that the like zip line that was there didn't have any kind of regulation, so we didn't know where those materials were. We didn't know if the steel was a good quality or what bad quality, and so on and so forth. What happened that because this was a construction made by the council, they assumed that their materials were good, right? Then we talked to the previous architects. But all of this, of course, generates like a new network of people with whom you are working. You're not only working you as an office, but you have to talk to the previous office that was doing the building. But I think that in a very near future, there's going to be companies who are like going to start to do certifications of these materials, i.e., if this material doesn't have a certification, I take a piece, I do a structural test, and I can give you the certification, right? Which basically poses like a new economy that is going to emerge, that is going to be based on how we are going to organize and manage all of these, and also presents like for the designers new aspect of embracing different things, because the regulations of inhabitation have also changed. For instance, if you look at a window from 20 years ago has a completely different regulation that a window has currently. But that doesn't mean that you can be, for instance, using multiple windows. And this, what is at least interesting for me, that is going to give a new set of design possibilities in which different spaces are going to come back to what it was in the past. No? If you really analyze, for instance, in Spain, the northern part of Spain, we always had what we called a gallery, which is like this space that is like kind of facing the exterior, that is in front of the main wall. And that space was always hitting the actual space during winter, right? And it will work as a ventilation during summer. So what I think is that there are new possibilities of design with this new approach of taking the materials that are already there, not only from the design point of view, but also from new industries that are going to emerge, or like business that are going to emerge with it.
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit skeptical about how quick that transition would happen. I mean, just because at the end of the day, the world sort of works on that supply demand, lowering the cost, right? Like the Amazon model, just customer always, right? Like screw workers, screw this, screw that, let's just lower the price. And I think that model is the one that we're in and we're going to be in for a minute. So I don't like to overly romanticize it and kind of reach this idea that soon we will be rebuilding with the same Legos over and over again, which might also lend itself to like some not so interesting stuff at the end of the day. So I think there's this weird balance that's going to happen. Similar to oil, like it's not going anywhere, and it's not so much better to crack for lithium either. So, you know, we still need to move, and that's what's going to drive the things forward. I wouldn't be surprised to see more and more of companies coming out with things that are rated specifically for assembly and disassembly. And I think a lot of the ingenuity comes from things like the intelligence of joinery systems and so on. So a lot of it can be done with things we already have. But it'll still probably be, to some extent, I guess, a sort of cost thing, which then brings again this kind of global north and global south dilemma, right? So if you can afford to do it that way, great. Otherwise, the people who don't have the funds are going to keep relying on those one-time building workflows. And yeah.
Hi, I had a question about the, sorry, first, thank you for the nice presentation. It was again very interesting. And I had a question about the course that you run at BPro of, because I also did BPro a few years ago. So it's a very curious question of what sort of agenda or goals does the studio have, you know, because like all the projects that you showed from there can also be seen as individual projects that you kind of did or something, but I'm just curious to see what sort of was the agenda for the students, you know, like either when they were doing the crypto at the territory or like reshaping landscapes or also like recycling the houses in the north. I think they all are very curious and interesting takes of how you see it and the way you kind of present it. But just from a pedagogical level or as what you teach, what's the kind of the agenda that they have and what are the different kind of groups? Do you just, you can pick one and just say just a general version.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Nice. Thanks for the question. And yeah, cool to have a small world, right? Like maybe from a pedagogical position, the hill that we try to get over with the students first is just generally speaking, understanding and contextualization. So this is always the kind of hardest because student enters a program and then typically expects one of two things. Either they're going to be told exactly what they're doing, and then they also just want to do what they saw last year, right? And so this kind of is the biggest challenge, getting 3, 4, 5 months of on the same page, and then after that, developing the project, right? So I think from a pedagogical position in terms of what are we trying to maybe instill in the students is the research part, right? Like what is the question that you're asking, and how do you kind of navigate that question and evolve it without kind of being too referential that you're copying, but not so non-referential that you're not building up on previous year's research, because also research has to kind of evolve from looking at what was done previously and just try to do it better and evolve and iterate and so on, right? So I think from one pedagogical perspective, that's kind of one of the angles that we try to take. The other one is, as I mentioned, maybe because it also applies to our own practice, is to not be dogmatic about any particular skill or technology or whatever it is. So if you can contextualize the project and build up a narrative around it and ground it on the research, then you can seek out the tools. And a lot of, like, I mean, I'm not a cryptographer, you know, but it's really interesting what cryptocurrencies provide, right? And on the one hand, on a good year, they provide you with a lot of money, which is great. On the other hand, they open up the door for actual applications that if they were to be taken out of that kind of market-driven scheme and thought of as something else, right? With the execution of smart contracts and so on and the Internet of Things, you can alter the way that we live. And I think that question maybe gets back a little bit to what Carolyn was asking. This is one of those examples of the dismantling of the thing. We somehow decided that borders are fixed, right? And but they're not fixed. I mean, we see, you know, there's people crossing each other's borders all the time, right? Sometimes in the format of a war, and sometimes in the format of just I don't know. There's this island in between. What is it, France and somebody else? They like pass over the island to each other once a year as a symbolic thing or something, right? And I think this idea of a border being the static thing, which doesn't make sense in a world that's fluctuating all the time, right? Is that idea that, for example, if I depend on fish as my resource, right? If the temperature changes, that year the fish are going to maybe be somewhere else, yeah? But I don't have access to that territory. But why don't I if I'm a fisherman, and why doesn't the other, you know? So I think it's this question of how do you network and use technologies in a way that isn't overly romantic, but just kind of can grab onto and then and deploy them for something that is just a little different than what we have at the moment, I think. So that's maybe the Arctic Everywhere project probably tries to just, okay, that's how cryptocurrencies work. That's the problem with resources at the moment. And how do we leverage the thing that we're so outdated in? Why is the idea of a fisherman this paradoxical thing? It's either me on my boat, romantic, right? Or it's me in this huge thing just dragging everything through the sea. And I'm sure there must be a middle ground. And maybe it's just because we haven't opened up into other technologies that can kind of facilitate that, right? So one of the themes that we deal with is this idea of preservation through adaptation. So that's why I like the Svalbard, decommissioning Svalbard, the final architecture speculated on is trying to preserve some ideas of identity, but not in the same way. It's not the exact church copied and pasted. They're trying to preserve something about how the inhabitants live their routines, but just compressing the footprint. So there's this notion of we got to keep something, but we got to let go of quite a bit. And I think maybe that's one of the things that we're trying to instill as well.
Also, like within the context of the BPRO and the entire program, I think we were probably one of the few units that was integrating narrative within the computational design thinking, that was not happening before. There was probably one research cluster that was also doing it at the same time as we were doing it. So what happened now is that when we were called to the BIPRO, we were surprised because we knew what was going on at the BIPRO, and we were feeling that what we were doing was quite different in like the approach to technology, I would say. So to a certain extent, we were given quite a lot of freedom to start to establish within the BIPRO a unit in which, or a research cluster in which contextualization was like an integral part of the project, which was not happening in the rest of the research cluster because usually it's much more driven through the technology that you are going to use. It is either robots or like if like in some instances there's like topicals housing, for instance, no, but not usual. But for us, I remember that when we arrived, one of the tutors was like, because the only thing that we say is that we are going to be working in the Arctic, and from that, like everything unfolded, right? Which was like quite weird because we didn't know with which technology we are going to be working. We only know that we have like interest in automation, we have interest in autonomy, we have interest in decolonization, we have like several interests, climate change, climate fiction, etc., etc. But we are not going to tell you with which tools we are going to work yet because we just arrived and we want to see what we can get out of this, right? And through like the years, we have been building up a team in which we are like quite permeable. So we have, for instance, we know that we are going to be working with Unity. We somehow play with Blender from time to time. We sometimes work with Unreal from time to time. But we are like we were like kind of lucky enough to like create a team, which like I think that also somehow we are like, that's the reason of the outcomes as well, is because it's not only us as tutors, it's like another 3 tutors that are more related to the skills of the students that are permeable and knowledgeable enough that when we are presenting something new, they are open to reshape whatever program we were doing on skills, for instance. Yeah, that's I think what I want to watch.
That's what, because I think they deserve the beer.
How did you come up with the idea for the design of the cover? Because like you showed us so many different projects, and this is only black and white. Is there a meaning behind this?
I don't think we've ever talked about that, so you can.
Maybe this would be the one that I need more time.
Of course, it requires a little bit of simplicity for the cover and so on and so forth. But the idea was to somehow that the cover would somehow present a little bit of what the concept was. So the first one, it was autonomy. And somehow like the autonomy we're feeling that was like a little bit more juggling in between wherever we like consider as how to give, empower and to provide autonomy. Whereas the second one that was more based on logistics, it was like much more like clear, almost like as a barcode that you can read.
But also, I mean, because it's an augmented magazine, the idea was to try to keep some notion of this QR code that we're familiar with. And we did work with graphic designers that sort of, it was a dialogue, right? Like it was, if you ever think about putting a book together, talk to somebody who's done it before, so you're sure of all the pain you're going to go through. But it's a very rewarding experience, and now that all the effort has been put into it, it's kind of easier to think about doing it again. Yeah, maybe it's like kids. I don't know. The first one's a bit like, oh my god, my world is flipped upside down, and then after the fourth, you're like, yeah, no, I know, you know. So I think it's a weird analogy, but maybe that's sort of where it's at. And why black and white? Because there wasn't any cost relationship or anything, so I think it was. I don't know. I don't have a good answer. But yeah, normally we're more colorful, and that was something that they told us when we entered the Pareid as well. They were like, stop using colors, right? Like they love the black and white, but then we sort of challenged that, and they sort of accepted it. Now others are using colors. Yeah.
So I think with this incognita that you write up, by the way, you see the double big still make mental wasteland.
Thank you.
The black and white. But I think that with this we can just leave it open.
Yeah.
And thank you very much for having for giving us a lecture. And yeah, the beer bar is now open.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Nearby.
Yeah, I think you have red wine, I'll go with the red wine. Do you want me to leave it plugged in with the lecture?
Oh, the
with
title?
Yeah,
No.
this one, the
Yeah,
affect.
no.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.